All right, aloha and welcome to day number 2 of Objective by the Sea. It was awesome to see pretty much everyone at the party last night. Yesterday was a great day. We have still a credible lineup of speakers. Kicking it off is Mike S. I've worked with Mike for a while at Synac. We've gone on some epic expeditions. You might have seen us on Vice News in Russia hacking. So you can ask Mike all about that, because we tried not to get arrested. So with no further ado, here's Mike. He's going to be talking about some really interesting pixel-related screen capture, Mac reverse engineering goodness. So let's give a round of applause for Mike.
How do I get it up here?
Okay, while Mike's getting this set up, I just also want to mention that we are going to be having the raffle at the end of the talks today around 4 p.m., so definitely stay for that. Again, we're giving away a Nintendo Switch, Apple Watch 4th generation, and some Apple EarPods, as well as some books from Jonathan Levin. So some really cool gifts, so make sure to stick around for that. And if you're leaving, give me your raffle ticket. So.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Patrick. I also want to thank everyone for coming. This is what's happening.
Okay, we're good.
Good?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Objective-C. Thanks, Patrick, for setting this up and getting everyone to Maui, especially me, because I've never been here before. But I have to say, there's a huge missed opportunity. Instead of having water on the tables, you should have had some apple juice.
True. Next year.
Next year. Anyway, so thank you for coming for my talk. I want to go through a very serious issue today. It's called theft of pixels, and there's a lot of nefarious actors out there that are doing it. And I hope that towards the end we can kind of find a way that we can propose a joint proposal to Apple to get that stuff fixed. Anyway, my name is Michael Sosonkin. I've kind of worked in a number of places, even had some time on HBO Vice, my 15 minutes fame with Patrick. So that was really cool stuff. Today I am here on behalf of Synac. We do crowdsource vulnerability discovery. So if you're into that sort of stuff, you should check them out and get paid for hacking some interesting customers. So kind of motivation for why I started doing this research. I've been looking at malware for quite a while, and I was always interested in the functionality that it does and why sort of people are doing this stuff. And so several things that kind of come to mind is, for example, like pranking. That's been around in the beginning when malware wasn't a big thing and people were just sending viruses to each other. Although these days it's a little bit more, let's say, actionable and dangerous. Things to do with hacktivism, ransomware. Compute theft is kind of a new phenomena, with all the Bitcoin mining and Monero coin mining. You see a lot of malware having to do with that. And of course, espionage, financial theft. I mean, people want information, people want money, so there's actors that go after people that have that stuff. What we'll be talking about here is a category for educational purposes, which means that we'll find out better ways to build malware, but keep it only to yourself for educational purposes. The outline, I'll talk about how I got inspired to do this specific thing for screenshot pixel capturing. And I'll go through some of the examination and the lower level details of how the mechanisms work, how we can actually abuse it, and the implications around that. Then we'll sort of bring it all together, look at some malware, look at some detection methods, and generally just celebrate because we're in Maui. So the way it sort of started is I was randomly looking at a report from Kaspersky that was published in May 2018. And this report looked at Android-based malware. Now I know it's a little bit of a heresy to say that here, but bear with me for a second. This definitely will go into Mac pretty soon. It's a malware that targeted Middle Eastern phones, particularly for stealing information. It's focused on particular types of information like contact lists, and it would exfiltrate that through HTTP GET requests from the phone into a command and control server. It was distributed through very kind of low-tech methods by social engineering through a watering hole technique, where it would essentially force the APK to be downloaded by this website that people go to all the time. And if someone is sort of, let's say, not tech savvy enough, they'll click on that and install it because they feel like they have to. Now, if you actually look at the progression of this Android malware, and I posted up a hash of it in case you're interested, you can look at it yourself as well. This malware had a progression over several years, and the first version was very basic. First, it would just look after accounts and steal sort of contacts from the phone. Then it progressed further until eventually it grew into this version 4 very advanced malware that steals all kinds of things like keylogs, clipping data, arbitrary files, and of course it would also do screenshots. Now, something that Kaspersky said is that they suspect that this is where the malware became professional. It was actually outsourced to another company compared to the other malware that was out there of the same family. Now, I got particularly interested in the screenshot part because I feel like a lot of people look at different types of malware and mention different things about contact lists and what have you, but nobody really talks about screenshots. And I feel like that's a very important part of where a lot of your private information is sort of displayed. I mean, if you're looking at a banking statement, if you're looking at some design documents, etc., you want to see it on your screen, and that's kind of, you know, the end or like the last step, and can be stolen from there. So that's one sort of motivation I had. The other motivation I had is that essentially I was using a MacBook Pro that was provided to me by my boss, and I was wondering if he was taking screenshots of what I was doing. I wasn't really doing anything bad on it. I was just kind of curious if he was keeping tabs on. That said, I went down this research line on OS X because, frankly, that's what I had available in front of me. And I don't really consider myself like an OS X or a Mac expert, so I feel a little bit out of place, but I hope that this is something that still is interesting, and you know, I definitely had a lot of sort of joy going through this process and definitely learned a lot about OS X. So when I started looking at this, screen capture is the thing that kind of, you know, is the most obvious starting point. That's the thing that does screen capturing on OS X. And it's a utility that is sort of in this SBIN directory, so clearly somebody thought that it's kind of an administrative purpose utility. And that's the utility that gets executed by you know, the UI when you press the special key combination to take a screenshot. So for example, if I talk to someone on Slack, I often just say Command-Shift-4 to select the thing that I'm talking about and send it to them. And behind the scenes, the screen capture utility gets called. So I wanted to look closer into what's going on behind the scenes. So I started reverse engineering it. I saw that it doesn't have any special permissions, even though someone thought it was for administrative purposes. There is no entitlements to speak of. It just functions. It just does its thing. If you do some reverse engineering on it, you can see that it actually shares a library with the Windows server. And most of the functionality happens within that library. And so the screen capture utility is actually just, you can say like a client or a shell for that library. Kind of jumping a little bit ahead, you have this mechanism of the client and server interaction with the Windows server. And to capture the actual pixels from the screen, the utility calls a function called capture desktop, which is implemented by the Skylight library. And then there is a corresponding server-side function called capture desktop with some different prefixes to actually execute that functionality. So if you kind of look at it a little bit deeper, we know that OS X is kind of like this two-phase kernel. So it's got the POSIX interface and it's got the Mach interface. Not a lot of people use mock interface in sort of the raw state, it's usually used as part of like a like a MIG interface, for example. It's generated by a compiler. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. And here we can see that the Skylight library actually uses the mock interface to communicate to itself through this client-server interaction. So the Skylight library runs within the Windows server and within the screen capture utility, and then it makes a connection, and then kind of the code runs within the same code base. And we can see that there are 3 different subsystems, and they all kind of interact with the client to perform the functionality. And this capture desktop is one of the handlers for a message within this interface. And there's for those that haven't done this before, there's a cool sort of writer's guide that can help to implement this stuff on your own. So on the high level, this is kind of what the sequence of events. This is what the sequence of events looks like. First, it does a little bootstrap lookup for the Windows server. So it looks specifically for a port that corresponds to name com.apple.windowserver.active. And that's what allows it to communicate to the service itself. And basically, at that point, it has the connection. It does this shutter sound. So initially, I thought this was a security feature. It's not, obviously not. But it's sort of a way to indicate that, hey, a screenshot's been taken. You should be aware of that. And then it just kind of ignores it. It has no significance whatsoever. The next thing that the screen capture does is it will look up, it will contact on that port that it looked up through Bootstrap, and it will request to communicate to the server. So it will create a session. It will say, hey, Windows server, can I please talk to you and request some pixels? It'll say, sure, talk to me on port number 6. And then it contacts port number 6 and says, please give me all the pixels. And says, yeah, no problem. You will find those pixels in this shared object within my memory location. And the screen capture utility, it goes and calls a function called macvmmap, which will map a shared object from this Windows server into the screen capture utility, download the pixels, well, quote unquote download, it will just read the pixels, encode them into a PNG or other file type, and then write them to disk or clipboard. So at this point, like, there's no actual security mechanism in place. Pretty much anything can do this as long as they know this API. So delving a little bit deeper into the assembly of what's happening there, I wanted to know how this Mac sort of MIG interface is working and how these steps translate into low-level code. And what I found is that there's a bunch of functions it calls. So here we can see it's looking it up using Bootstrap. So you can think of it as kind of like the DNS of Mac interfaces. I like to use things that I understand. And so it looks up the port, and then it creates a session to that port. And so here we can see that it's using a message 7468 to generate the request to connect to the server itself. And then when it connects, the server responds back with another session port and says, okay, well, you've connected, now you can use this other port to actually communicate to me. Once it made that connection, it will make the actual pixel request. And here we can see that it creates a message called message number 732A, which will actually make that request for give me the contents of the screen, but it sends certain parameters. So it sends the rectangle of where you want to capture the pixels. So you can see it starts at 00 and goes 1024 to 768. So it's kind of like grabs that small small rectangle of pixels. And you also have to supply the display ID. So that's an internal number that, frankly, I've never seen change in my my testing, and I've plugged in different displays. I've used VMware, so you can kind of use it as a way to identify same machines if you, let's say, if you're a malicious actor hopping around. And you have to pass in this parameter, which I haven't figured out where it was. It's just you kind of have to put that number in there, and then it works. And so once that request is fulfilled, it comes back with information about what is the actual object number for a shared object between these two processes. And then it uses the VM map to actually share the map that object onto the local process. So cool. So going through this reverse engineering process, I've kind of reconstructed the most minimal form using API to do screen capturing for all the screens on the display or connected to the system. And basically what you do is you say CG get active display list. It gives you all the IDs that you're required to make requests to. And this will include pretty much every display that's connected. So if I have one that's on the laptop, an external display, it'll kind of list them all in there. Next, you just iterate and you say, I want the image for every one of those displays. You call the function cgDisplay create image, and then it will send those pixels back to you. You can encode them and either upload them somewhere or store it on the file system. So that's kind of, if I was building malware, this is kind of the function I would use to do that, because obviously I can control the APIs and I don't have to rely on Apple not to force things like shutter sound or any other properties that might come with the capture utility. As I was doing this work, I wanted to kind of understand better how this interaction goes between the client and the server. And if you've ever tried to kind of sniff mock messages, it can be a laborious task because there's so many different messages going through for all kinds of different purposes. And so I kind of co-opted a utility written by Jonathan Levin to capture those particular messages, right? So you can see here I used function interposition, which essentially means that I can inject a dilib into the process, and then the linker will actually force my functions to be proxies for those real functions. So I proxied bootstrap lookup, mock message, and mock message override in order to see what the messages are between the client and the server. And so having this smaller version of the capture utility, it was a lot easier to hone down on the particular messages associated with this functionality. There were still like thousands of messages going back and forth, but it was easier to look at this. All right, so kind of wrapping it all up, the way it's worked out is that the sequence of events is something like this. You have message 7152, which starts the session. Then you have 7148, which tests the connection. So as I mentioned, a lot of these MIG interfaces are actually compiler generated. And so they have to be completely aligned with their versioning. Otherwise, there could be a lot of problems because you have structures flying back and forth. And so in this case, it just says, okay, is this version correct? If so, then let's move on. The next one is 7475, which gets the display state, and that's the message that actually lists all the IDs associated with the displays connected to the system. Then you have 7468, which does the secondary session, which I'm not entirely sure why you have the two sessions, but it's in there. And then you have 732A, which is the actual request for those pixels. In the end, once the messages go through, it does the mapping and encodes the pixels and does whatever nefarious things it wants to do with it. As I was doing this research, I found that this is something that other people have looked at as well. There was a blog post that talked about CG window list create image that does essentially the same thing, and they've actually reported this to Apple. So you can see there's an issue ID in place, and I'm hoping that Apple will eventually fix those stuff, because it seems like it's important. All right, so we kind of seen some of the low-level interfaces, how to make this a little bit better, and what is the actual impact of this, right? So I was wondering, what happens with the different sandboxes, because clearly they're there meant to protect us. And I always think of a sandbox as, the execution is limited to that particular window, which is not entirely correct thinking, but that's kind of how you want to think about this. In this case, that's not how it works. So I built a little demo where we can see if you build a utility using the Cocoa framework and take some screenshots, it will take the pixels of the entire screen and not even complain about it. So here we go. We can see it took all of the pixels on the screen. if you can see on this side, this is where the app sandbox definition is happening. The only thing I changed is this download folder permission, where I allowed it to write to the download folder so that I can essentially do the demo. All the other permissions are completely turned off, and so essentially what this means is that if you download an app from the App Store, it's going to have access to your entire screen, and there's nothing you can do about it. So I was wondering, what are the actual other sandboxes out there? I mean, they all rely on the same, macOS sandbox for the process, but they have different definitions for what they do. And in the end, what happens is that the sandbox has to allow you to contact the Windows server in order to provide this functionality to you. Now, the reason for that is because you want to be able to actually create, windows, draw things on the screen, and for that you need access to the Windows server. Unfortunately, what also means that you get access to the entire Windows server, not just a subset of it. And in this case, what happens is that even though the port numbers could be slightly predictable, they're within like the low ranges of the numbers, you can't actually brute force for it. And this is one thing I found that's very cool about the sandbox itself, is that unless you explicitly allow for a particular string to be looked up by the bootstrap process, you can't actually find that port by brute forcing for that number. So it'll block those things altogether. And I found that in Chrome, you have 3 processes that have access to this Windows server. You have the CDM process, which does all the content decryption or decoding, rendering, which is very known for all kinds of buffer overflows and problems with decoding content from untrusted sources. So if you can get shellcode to execute on one of those processes, then you're kind of in that awkward position, because now you can have shellcode executing and looking for screen pixels from those processes. The other ones were GPU to UI server interactions, which you do need that kind of permission. And you have the plugins, which are actually also used by Opera and Vivaldi browsers as well, to sort of get that connection to the Windows server. Cool. So the other sandboxes I've looked at is Firefox. It has wine plugin sandbox. I don't know what it is, but it's some sort of a DRM mechanisms that's used by Chromium and Android as well. You have the Flash plugin, which is obviously the safe mode where you'd want it to have access to the entire Windows server, and Flash has never had any sort of problems before in the past. Totally trusted. The content sandbox, so any sort of content rendering happens in this process, and this is where it has access to the Windows server. So it's not necessarily like a bad thing. I mean, who knows what kind of stuff you can do in there, but it's not necessarily comfortable for these sort of processes to be, essentially in a position where they can read more screen than you'd like it to be able to. And of course, none of this requires any 0 days. Like you just have access to the Windows server, and you just request the pixels from that point. By looking at various sandboxes, I saw that Gecko has this positron experimental browser as well. So it has certain things accessing the sandbox as well. So the content process, for example, or the plugin process as well. So the stuff is out there. Of course, WebKit, it's got 2 processes that are allowed to access the Windows server. It's the web process and the plugin process. Clearly, the 2 things that do the most benign type of processing, parsing out there. So it's kind of an issue that all these things have access to so much of the attack surface of the Windows server, because clearly it's not necessarily something you'd want it to do. For example, I was able to use a utility I built a while back to build shellcode, to generate shellcode to do the screen capture in about 9,000 bytes. Right? I mean, that's pretty large for shellcode, but you can probably make it smaller. The only issue is that if you actually do this exploit, can you get it to export those pixels somewhere else? And that's kind of an open question for me right now. If you are building some industrial-grade malware or educational-grade malware, let's say, you may want to hone it in a little bit. So one thing I discovered is that you can actually take screenshots of the touch bar in the new Macs. I'm not entirely sure why you'd want to do that, but the capability is there. If you take the screenshot of the entire screen, like for example the Mac Pro I have here, that's about 1.4 megabytes of compressed data. Like you're not going to be compressing stuff in your shellcode maybe. On the other hand, you can figure out what the user is doing and kind of have this targeted screenshotting capability in place. So for example, you can see when they're in Chrome, you know, it tells you, it's got a nice little logo. Or you can see when they're using Sublime and they've got some secret documents open. Maybe that's something to pay attention to. Or if you have a system administrator and they're configuring the network, you can see when the terminal is open. So it's a way for you to be able to kind of more efficiently find time when to take the screenshots. All right, so that's cool. So I mean, we kind of had this exercise where we talked a lot about how to build better malware. But what malware is out there that actually does the screen capturing? And I didn't have access to VirusTotal, and I won't say who was able to run things for me. Essentially, I wanted to build a rule that would find as much malware as possible that could potentially have any of this capability out there. So I looked for screen capture, I looked for CG create image, and I looked for the mock message message that's being sent to create this request. I was really hoping I would find some malware that would use the mock message directly, but I didn't. On the other hand, I found plenty of the other ones. And I found plenty of false alarms, false positives as well. I mean, this was a pretty broad signature. Like I said, I didn't have access, so I only had one shot to do this. I found that there were about 1,100 samples matched. Most of those were people uploading the Skylight library. I don't know why they do that. A lot of those, the ones that got flagged, at least one AV flagged them. There were about 15 samples, and 6 of them were flagged by more than one AV. So, you know, if you're doing something a little bit more production, you might want to hone in your Yarrow signatures, but this was pretty good for this research. Kind of diverting a little bit, this is, again, because I didn't have access to VirusTotal, I wrote a script that essentially would download as many hashes as possible and give me reports on them. Now, unfortunately, if you don't have an account, they will throttle you, but the way they throttle you is they will send you 0 content. So instead of being slow, they force you to be clever. So if I just posted it up there in case you want to reproduce any of this research, and here's the script available for you. So the first malware that I want to mention, it's called Mox. It's very popular. Here's a hash for it. It uses the core graphics library, which maps to the Skylight library, and it uses the Qt library to access that. Specifically, it calls the function called grabWindow, which essentially does abuse the same API, well, it uses the same APIs that I've mentioned before, and it just scans through all the monitors and grabs those pixels, sends them back to the user. In this case, this malware, the Mox malware, will actually do that every 30 seconds, presumably looking for something interesting. I don't know what they did with that. The other malware is called Max. It uses a screen capture library, or sorry, a utility. It disables the shutter sound, so makes it extra stealthy. And it has this delay of 20 seconds, which I found interesting. I guess if you do discover that there is a screen capture that's been taken, and there's a 20-second delay, maybe you could potentially blame it on something else because the correlation will be broken. On the other hand, it does take a lot of screenshots. It dumps them into a Mac app folder, which I assume looks kind of innocuous. I mean, if a non-tech savvy person looks at that, they wouldn't think twice about it, I guess. On the other hand, they could be stealing some secret documents for like F-35 designs or something. I don't know. The third one is a black hole. That one had a PPC version. Does anyone have a Mac with PowerPC? I don't. I don't know if anyone actually uses those anymore. But kind of cool. Why not? It stores its screen captures in a .hidden directory, which is interesting because if you use a .hidden directory, the Finder what's it called, file database doesn't actually look in there. So technically speaking, it's more or less hidden. However, no one actually, if you look at the reports out there on this malware, no one actually does any work of analyzing or reporting to say that this has a screen capture capability. It's probably not so significant that people want to report on that. I don't know. I feel like it's significant. And finally, there was this interesting malware, not quite malware. Someone uploaded a virtual image. I don't know why. I didn't find any specific portions of the malware inside of it. I think there might have been something like that, but this is why it matched. So it was just interesting that somebody would upload that. More recently, there was a report by Dark Matter at Hack in the Box that talked about this really advanced APT that was attributed to certain actors. And it had what's called a wind tape component to it, which actually does backdoor screenshot taking. If anybody has a sample of this, I would like a copy, please. If not, that's okay. Okay, so there's some malware, there's some mechanisms that we can use. How do we actually find that this behavior exists on your machine, right? This is kind of like the important part of, well, now we want to detect someone trying to steal pixels on your box. So I thought, okay, there's some rudimentary ways you can do this. Like you can use mdefined to find screenshots, because if you use the screen capture utility, as we saw many Mac malware doing, that utility will put on an attribute inside of the file saying that, hey, this is a screenshot. Now, one of the problems with that is, of course, the files in a hidden directory, well, hidden, will not be discovered by this. On the other hand, some malware doesn't actually hide their files for some reason. So I'm still not sure why any advanced malware would actually create files and have this sort of trail in place and have so much noise in the system. But it's a way to kind of get the bar raised a little bit. Some of the other ways you can do this, you can try attaching Frida or dtrace to actually do some lightweight tracing of the function execution. So if someone does call the function capture desktop, it will notify you. It's not really a production grade type of thing, but you might be able to do it in your box. Unfortunately, you do have to turn off SIP for it, because SIP doesn't allow you to trace Windows Server, which is cool. It's a little blunt, but I mean that's a good capability to have. If you do this, you can actually, when you breakpoint on the capture display capture desktop function, you can trace back to who actually made that request. So one of the things sent to this function is a source port number. And so using this source port number, you can use a utility like LSMP to look up which process actually requested the pixels. And from there, you potentially could say, well, should this process actually be allowed to request screen captures? Cool, so anything about defenses? I mean, this is kind of where it would be nice if Apple introduced more features. So this is kind of how I'd like to propose some functionality that would be nice to have. So for example, logging, right? We kind of mentioned some ways to trace the functionality of the things that get executed on the Windows Server. It would be nice to have some limited way of logging the functions that get executed, especially like key functions like screen capture in SIP-enabled processes. So it'd be nice to have like a pop-up that says, hey, by the way, someone just requested a screen capture, you should be notified of that. Another one, kind of like a filter, a firewall per se, of types. I might be able to say, okay, my media decoding process may have access to the Windows Server, but maybe it shouldn't have access to this particular functionality of Windows Server. Maybe look for a particular type of message ID in the Mac interface and say deny that specific message ID. I mean, there's a lot of performance implications there, but I feel like there is a way to find sort of a good balance where you can still filter things out and at the same time have these protections. or have that performance. Finally, it'd be nice if screen capture utilities required entitlements. That's probably the more obvious way of doing this thing, because an entitlement allows you to have signed processes and enforce that unsigned processes do not request this functionality. And in Mojave, there's already sort of a start on this. Like if a process requests access to the camera or the microphone, like it'll alert you on that. Like it's pretty useful. So why not include screen capture into that same sort of category of features to alert users on? So if there's anyone from Apple, please take note. All right. So in closing, I hope you enjoyed this. I just wanted to mention some more about malware. Like what I found interesting is that there's a lot of malware-looking malware. So they have anti-debugging features. They have lots of anti-analysis features. However, the most sort of nefarious stuff, the ones that are targeted to specific organization or user, etc., they actually don't employ a lot of those techniques. And so you kind of have to start looking at functionality as a whole as a way to say, do I want this program or do I want these features to be available in the box, and do I find that risky? You know, we had guys from Digita yesterday talking about how you can build this game engine and say, okay, these are the rules for my machine. If anything of those rules happens, I want to be notified of that. All right, so in conclusion, talked about pixel stealing. Hope you enjoyed that. Some mock interfaces. I find those things pretty fascinating because everyone kind of focuses on POSIX interface when they're doing development, but mock is a huge target. And some proposed mitigation. So you know, maybe afterwards we can chat about, and you can tell me if I'm being crazy or if these are actually viable options to protect. With that, thanks again, and if you have any questions.
Mechanisms you propose, which would be your preferred preference as someone who might write a tool to perhaps detect this or prevent this?
I would say that this mechanism, which, of the proposals that I made for the mitigations, which ones are my favorite or preferred options for implementation by, let's say, a Mac security professional? Well, you can't see it now, but I think the sandbox mechanism with entitlements is the most likely one to get implemented. But I really like the option of the firewall because that's the one that has the most granular and controllable way of defining your protection.
Would that have to be implemented in kernel mode to see the mock messages going through, or?
I think it would have to be, because otherwise, how would you enforce that? Sorry, the question is, do you have to do this in the kernel or do you have to do this in the user space? And I think that you would have to do it in the kernel in order to enforce it and prevent malware from getting around it.
Sandbox is actually, I'll agree with you, it's actually a really good choice for 1014 at least, because with the TCC profiles, you can actually, part of the payload specifications, you can specify the signer of the binary and whether you have access to a particular API. So there's already a pre-made configuration mechanism built into the operating system that's behind the gateway of DEP or user root MDM, which is basically the only people who would not get a dialog popping in their face because of that configuration is the enterprise environment. So that's actually, I think, probably the most compatible choice for these types of protections. And yeah, the kernel enforcement, I think, would be really fine.
This is very cool. I will not repeat that question. You guys go and ask him about it. But it's a lot of interesting information. Can I get a copy of it? Sweet. Thank you. Yeah. Send it to me by email. Even better. Well, thanks all. Thanks for your attention.